Hello everybody and welcome to another Kirklees Library session with our writer-in-residence, Christina Longdon. Hello, Chris.
Hello, hi there.
Morning.
Hiya.
and Jazz. Morning, Jazz.
Hiya, morning.
A development librarian for Kirklees Libraries, and I'll be talking about non-fiction today. So Chris has written both fiction and non-fiction, and she'd like to share her experience with us today to encourage anybody who's starting to write as a career or just for fun. So please send in your questions for Chris during the session using the live feed on YouTube or Facebook. Oh, thank you. Okay, so we'll go to hand it over to Chris now.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the next session. This one is going to be a bit of a mix-up of a session because, first of all, I'm going to be chatting a little bit about why we tend to think of fiction instantly when we think of books and we think of writing and becoming a writer. This is the conclusion that a lot of people instantly jump to. And then I'll be talking a little bit about my own writing journey and how I don't have the not that there is a typical writing journey, but I certainly don't have the typical writing journey that a lot of people expect. I'm going to chuck an exercise at you a little bit later on, so you don't have to do it here and now. You can jot it down or come back and watch it again to help you think a little bit more about the issues I'll be chatting about with my wonderful colleagues at Kirklees Libraries today. And then I'm going to get really excited about some of my favourite books which mash the two together, fiction and non-fiction, which I'll chat about in a little while. And I've got some fantastic friends. I think Jazz and maybe Kirsty will be coming on to chat about theirs as well. And if you stay to the end, you will be rewarded with a Christmas shopping list. If you really want to pursue writing, if you want to do a bit more with it, and you want to give some ideas to your loved ones or things to buy for you at Christmas, just stick to the end and hopefully I can help you out a bit with that as well. So just to kick off with, I'll chat a little bit about how I began with writing. And if you've watched any of the previous sessions, you might recall that I said I never felt I could be a writer. It was a dream. It was, if you'd asked me as a kid, what is it you most love to do? I would have said writing, but it was just not a practical prospect for me to do. But I carried on writing in my career, and my background is in social housing. So I worked on a lot of the what are termed to be the really rough estates of Manchester, and that's a long story how I got into that. But most of the time I was out there on the streets in the estates, but I also had to write really dull reports, and that was the only exercise that I got, I guess, in my early career for writing. And then I wasn't that bad at writing dull reports, so I ended up working in policy. I ended up then working for a consultancy, producing policy for the government, and even ended up writing speeches for ministers. So I'm still writing, but it's all non-fiction writing. I'm not making up things for the government to say. Well, not that they never do that, but it certainly didn't come from me. So that was really what my direction was until that point. And even then I didn't think, oh, one day I'd love to, write some fiction. Never thought that. It was all kind of hidden. And it wasn't until I ran off, left the country and went to live in Namibia, which is in Southern Africa, that I actually got the chance to do some actual, what we call book writing. And whilst I was out there, I was living and working with the Kalahari Bushmen. Some of you might have heard of the San Bushmen, as they're known. And they're one of the most discriminated against Indigenous people's groups in the world. And they have enormous issues, enormous problems. And so I was there trying to help out in my own little way. And one of the things that I was asked to do was to write a book using their words. So basically I was commissioned to write a book, which was just, wow, why me kind of moment. And so I worked with the Bushmen themselves and the young people, and they carried out over 100 interviews of the Hangkong people who live in the Etosha area, which is a massive, massive game reserve the size of Wales in Namibia. And it was all about collecting their stories, how they've been kicked off their land, how they've been treated under colonialism, how apartheid had affected them, what happened since apartheid had ended, putting that together in the form of a book. And this was my first one. There you go. Photography by me as well. Well, not all of it, but this was an amazing thing to have done. And I thoroughly enjoyed the process. It was incredibly creative. And I can't, I can't tell you enough how much of an honour it felt to do it, and I don't mean that in a cheesy way, because the people whose stories are in that book, they had never ever been listened to before, and for me to go away and knit together everything they said and turn it into a story, a presentation of their suffering and what happened to them, it really was an honour. And then I did another one, similar stories with the elders, and then I came back to the UK after a few years, and it was just that I'd been bitten by the writing bug. And it never occurred to me to write fiction because I've written these non-fiction books and I knew I was okay at it. I knew I'd not done a bad job. And when I came back to live in West Yorkshire, there was obviously something in me then that wanted to carry on writing. And I heard about a local writing group, whom I've mentioned before, Holmfirth Writers Group, yay. And I snuck along to the library in Holmfirth where they have the meetings and hung around and checked that they weren't complete weirdos. And they looked really lovely and friendly and they invited me along. And this was the first time ever I'd read out any of my work as fiction. So with that incentive of having a writing group behind me and encouraging me, I did go away and write stuff. And we had a critique group and they read some stuff that I'd written, which actually ended up becoming this, my first fiction book, Mind Games and Ministers. And they just encouraged me to develop the story that I'd come up with. Again, based in the Northwest, I like politics, I like humour, I like gritty social situations. So this is what it was all about. But the thing was, I actually went away and wrote 240,000 words, which is quite a lot of words to write. I don't think my family saw me for a year or so, but I was just completely into the writing process. And 240,000 words. Okay, your average novel, is 80 to 100,000 words. It's still a pretty big novel. And a writer friend there, Kim Walker, who's a great writer, said to me, "Do you know what? You've got 2 books there. Why don't you do it? You could do a series, 2 books." So this is what happened. So the second part, really, although I wrote them as standalones, is this one, Upside Down, Cuckoo in the Chocolate. Again, same story, same characters, new developments in it, and that was a massive creative learning curve for me to write a standalone book that you could have read the first, you haven't read the first, you have to pick it up. It's a huge skill involved in that, and maybe do a workshop on that later on actually, because it's great for learning how to do that. So that was where I was up to. I'd done these 2 books, I'd done 2 non-fiction, I'd done 2 fiction, and it was what now? And again, I think I tend to operate never on, I have to produce, I am a writer, I have to be having a product at the end of it. And I think that probably is, for me anyway, the right way to write. And for a few years, okay, I took a little bit of a rest for a while, but for a few years, friends and family have been nudging me to write this incredible story, a family history story from my family. And I kept, for whatever reason, I felt that I wasn't the right person to do it. It was again, I guess it was one of those moments of, wow, this is such precious material. I'm not worthy to go away and write this. But thankfully, a few friends beat me up and told me to get a grip and to go and do it, because if I didn't do it, it would never happen. So this is what happened. I then got commissioned to write this book about this incredible family history story of ours, which is basically my great granddad was a Muslim and he converted to Islam in 1898, and our family covered this up for 100 years. And my dad made the discovery when he was looking into our family history, and it was just a wow moment, not just because of itself, that happening in that era was massive, but also because my brother had become a Muslim in 1990 knowing nothing about this. So you've already got a fantastic story there. So what I had to do to honor this incredible story really was to go and do the research, and that became this book, His Own Man. So this is a piece of historical research. It incorporates a lot of northern history, a lot of local history, a lot of political stuff, trying to find out about this incredible guy, which is incredibly difficult if you're from a working class background and your name isn't there across the newspaper and your family haven't got all these documents and diaries. If anything, they've actually tried to hide your existence. So that was me going back to my roots, really, of loving history, which I did study at university, but never dreamed I would actually write a history book. Now, this is where the bit about faction comes into it, because having done all of that research and having lived in the archives in Tameside in Ashton for a long time and done my absolute best to do this man justice, I just kept getting asked by people, but what did his wife think, and why did he cover it up, and why? And I thought, well, the only way I can bring to life what I think, might be completely wrong, might just be conjecture, is by creating a work of fiction, which is why I ended up doing yet again 2 books when I should have been writing 1. This is a story of my lifetime. This is the next book, called Imagining Rabbit, and this was actually written in dialogue, because I love writing dialogue, and you can write more of a story when you're writing dialogue. So I wrote this book, and this is all about my supposition, if you like, of why he made those decisions, where he come from, and fill in those gaps that you just can't get from non-fiction. I mean, some people who are into non-fiction not particularly interested in filling the gaps, but I was, because family history in particular, and local history, it just feels like the key to unlocking your own existence and where you come from, and all. Any of you who do family history watching this will get what I'm talking about here. So this was, for me, a wonderful process, very emotional process, because I felt like I got to know this person, who died in 1911. It was just fantastic. So what I'm going to talk about now is, if we can have the slides, Nicola's got some slides I'm just going to talk through a little bit, is the actual process of why we look at fiction as, I suppose, the first subject area that we might want to address as a writer. So I'm going to compare the two a little bit. So Nicola, if you can bring the next point up, then I'll chat about that. So fiction does get an awful lot more attention, and there's various reasons for this. One of them is, at schools tend to focus a little bit more on, I suppose, writing and literacy as being the product of a story. But this is where non-fiction is really important. I don't know if any of you relied on the school, as I did, very much to get facts and figures. We didn't have the internet back in those days. You had to go to your school library or your local library. Nicola, can you bring the next point up? And the next one. Sorry, I'm gabbing ahead of myself here. I'm getting very excited. But the other reason why I would say that fiction is particularly focused on when we think about writing is because there is this huge perceived glamour of it. You know, we hear about the award-winning authors, and we hear about the money involved, and I won't shatter anybody's dreams there, but it doesn't happen. There is, in storytelling though, as well, something innate in all of us, and even those people who are huge fans of non-fiction as a book would probably admit that there's something even in non-fiction that is the process of telling stories. It's escapism in particular, and this is why fiction tends to predominate. You know, we live in an increasingly busy world, and we need that entertainment. We need to escape. The industry of the entertainment industry it has a huge impact on the way that we perceive writing and the way that we feel, oh, it's a story, it's got to be a film, it's got to be this, it's got to be that. But again, storytelling, the fiction side of thing, also has huge beneficial therapeutic effects as well. But the money side of it, you know, the interesting bit that a lot of people don't realize is there is a lot more money in producing non-fiction work than there is in fiction. It generates 3 times revenue more than the fiction industry does in the book selling world. Thank you, Nicola. So let's have a little bit look at non-fiction. First of all, as I said earlier, the pre-internet generation completely relied on non-fiction books. And we might well find, I haven't seen any studies on this, that my generation and generation above have more of a fondness for actual holding a non-fiction book in our hand. There's that historical thing of, like, for example, the facts of life. Sorry, Mum, I shouldn't tell people this, but I actually learned it from the school library. I went along to the school library. Now, these days, you just go and find out. Google would give you all of this. So there is this complete reliance still on non-fiction, and as I said, they're a huge bestseller, particularly for gifts for people as well. Next up, humans can depend on non-fiction for survival. That's such an obvious thing to say, but everything that we tend to do in our lives, we're looking for the facts, we're looking for we might go to the internet, we might pick up a book. I'll talk about some of the genres later on involved in non-fiction, and if you want to write non-fiction. But it's crucial. You know, word of mouth is great for survival, but to actually get the facts from these so-called experts, the non-fiction writers, that can keep us going through all kinds of things, disease, parenting crises, you name it. Thanks. And it is easier to be noticed as well. And again, this is something I wasn't aware of when I decided to go into writing, that because everybody has this perception of, oh, you know, best-selling author, J.K. Rowling, that's what you aim to be. It's a heck of a lot harder. Anybody in the publishing industry will tell you, to be traditionally published, if you're writing fiction, you have to have one fantastic idea and concept and be a good writer, even though some people say it's not fantastic. And you also need to know people in the industry. This is again something that I won't get on my high horse about right now, but it's a lot easier to be noticed if you've got a fab idea about writing a piece of non-fiction, and it's going to be a little bit different than the other book on parenting that you were into. It's easier to get noticed because the industry wants to sell non-fiction. Thanks, Nicola. Next. I have to keep shouting next. So what sort of non-fiction could I write? There are many. The first thing that you might want to think of is, do I have to go and write a book? And I think that's a trap that a lot of us fall into is, okay, I've got a great idea. It has to be a book and it has to be this big and it has to be traditionally published and I have to go and find an agent and I have to. Not at all. Not these days, not anymore. The last 20 years, the last 10 years even, everything has changed. And so the way that you maybe thought about writing 20 years ago and the approach that you would have now is completely different. So one of the things that you might want to do, if you want to explore what we're talking about today, non-fiction, is you might want to go away and have a little whack of a short. Maybe something that would go on the internet, maybe something that you could send off to a magazine, maybe a blog, maybe a competition that's asking for a non-fiction contribution. So you don't necessarily have to start with books. And actually, I would say that writing something shorter is trickier, but you will refine your writing muscle a lot quicker. Areas I'm sure you're all familiar with when you go into a bookshop or the library, which section you want to head for first. But what I'm going to try and help you to do shortly is to sort of broaden it out a little bit more. So you might be going for travel, cookery, science, gardening, self-help, wellness, all of these other ones. They will be the typical ones, the big sellers. And you can, when you want to write a book, actually find a specialist publisher in this area. And we can maybe talk about that in a future session as well. Okay. Now, this is the bit that I wanted to spend a little bit of time of looking at today. The word faction, which many of you won't have heard of in terms of the literary world. Right, the word faction is a blend, obviously, of non-fiction and fiction. And this is basically an example of how you might refer to it. You might refer to as faction as a non-fiction novel. You might refer to it as auto-fiction or in-between narratives. Here is the definition. Faction depicts real historical figures and actual events woven together with fiction, and it uses the storytelling technique of fiction. And I bet if you've ever read what you think is fiction, you will have read faction, because there's more and more of it these days. But it's not a term that we tend to know. We tend to think of, oh, that's fiction. I'll give you some examples in a minute. Thanks, Nicola. Now, there's the in-betweeners as well, fan fiction. This is great. The creation of a new work of fiction based on existing works of fiction. So, for example, if you're a Star Wars fan, if you're into Lord of the Rings, if you're into Star Trek, into Sherlock Holmes, you might already know a lot about fan fiction. And I would say, if you're under a certain age, you will definitely know about fan fiction. You will have read it because it's just boomed again in the last 20 years. And again, it's something that I would never have thought that I had written in my life. And I'm a fan of various things. I won't bore you what I am a fan of, but I would never ever have thought to say, well, actually, I have written fan fiction, but I have, because this is a massive confession to make. I'm going to be hideously embarrassed now, but the first bit of writing that I ever did was about Duran Duran. And guess what? I ended up marrying one of them. It never came true. John Taylor, if you're out there and you're at a loose end. But I wrote fan fiction, and I didn't know that until recently. And, now I feel actually quite good about it, because I was hideously embarrassed about this at the time. And I'm sure most teenagers have done some kind of fan fiction writing or thought about it. But yeah, that got me writing. And I would say, this is something, please don't look down your nose at fan fiction. It's fantastic. Also, I don't know if I've mentioned this later on in the slides, but there's a lot of money in fan fiction. If you can get that published. Thanks, Nicola. Again, that isn't fan fiction. That's a previous slide. It doesn't depict historical figures. So let's move on to the next slide. But it does use a storytelling technique, and it's something that comes very much from you. Now, what I'm going to do is, here is a little exercise for you to do, and you can take it away and do it if you want. So get yourself a stopwatch. You've got 1 minute, and we're going to be looking at faction, playing around with it. Okay. Jot down 8 for each. Here we go. Piece of paper. Going to be jotting down 8 for each of these. So you've got, I think, what's up next, Nicola? Is it your non-fiction? Okay, so think about non-fiction in the past that you loved, and think about fiction that you love now. There's a huge list for you: memoir, self-help, manuals, specific subjects, gardening, animals, humour, politics, memoirs, crafting, parenting. You can read them all there. So jot down 8 of these that you would be quite happy to get a book for Christmas or for your birthday, or to wander into the library. Which section would you naturally gravitate towards? Thanks, Nicola. And then when you've done that, I want you to jot down 8 fiction. So set yourself a table up. So here we've got, over here on the non-fiction side, on the right hand side, you've got the 8 things that you would normally gravitate towards. And on the left hand side, you've got 8 fiction areas that you like. So again, start off with your 8 non-fiction, and then jot down 8 different areas of fiction that appeal to you. Now, this is the bit where, when you've got a bit of time, have a play around with it. Get yourself an arrow and draw historical sagas and drag it right up to politics, thriller to cookery. This is just designed to have a go at creating an outline for a story. And sometimes, if we like a certain genre and we think, oh, I want to write romance, I love reading romance, oh, I really love thrillers, I want to write thriller and it's going to be this way. Sometimes you'll find, especially if you've not had a lot of experience, you're churning out something that's basically an absolute replica of a story. Say you've just written The Godfather without realizing it. And this really is to get you thinking a little bit more, using real life events from the past, perhaps from the non-fiction side that you're familiar with, gardening, and just throwing it over into a fiction genre that you're comfortable with writing in. And it can produce some wacky stories, but also some really exciting ones. And to get you thinking a little bit more. So do that in your own time when you've got a few minutes. And if you come out with a cracking story, please let me know as a result of this, because I think sometimes we're all so constrained, and it has to be non-fiction, it's this way, it has to be fiction, it's this way. And this is a beautiful thing about writing faction. You can use whatever you want. You can write a whodunit about a gardener. You can write a family history where they're all spies, but draw from real life. I won't talk about litigation. We can talk about litigation in another section. But basically, you can get around most things if you're using real life people and characters. But obviously, it's something that you want to be a bit careful of. And I had to be quite careful of that in the Robert story, but not as much as you would be if it was set in the modern day setting, because everybody had died in my story. Okay, thanks, Nicola. Right, where your passion lies. This is, you've made it to the end, and I'll talk about my books in a minute, but this is your Christmas shopping list, really. I should be really on commission for writing magazines, because they have helped me so much, and I'm not even quite sure how I found out about them. I've got an example. Here we go. The Fantastic Writing Magazine. You can get a submission for this, and it all depends. Do you want to read a book about learning to write, or you want to read a magazine about it? And these are just fantastic. There's also Writers Forum magazine. There's many others, but I do particularly recommend Writing Magazine and Writers Forum magazine for getting you reading. And these are 2 great books as well. As I mentioned before, if you want to dip your toes into the water of non-fiction and you're not confident immediately to feel I'm a great expert on this, I can go and write a book of 80,000 words. Have a little go at writing for magazines. There's all kinds of information and advice online, but this is a particularly good book, Writing for Magazines, which I don't know if it's been updated since I got it, but it's a really good read. And it'll give you great advice on how to pitch your idea, rather than just immediately writing an article and hoping that somebody will print it. Classic error that most people have done. And this is another one, if you're interested in the money side of it. Like I said before, you can make money from writing. I'll keep saying you can't make a lot, but you really can. And this is a great book that you can purchase as well. But there's plenty more. Kirklees Libraries has got lots of books on writing. The other thing I would recommend is, if you're looking for this Christmas present, you could ask your loved one to pay for you to join the Royal Society of Authors or the Writers Guild. Royal Society of Authors, for example, the trade union of professional writers. But as an amateur or a beginner, it's still a really great thing to do, is to take out a subscription, because you will learn so much from them, and everything's in one place, and they are just so supportive, and they'll give you that one-to-one support as well. The Writers and Artists Yearbook, this is the best stocking filler ever. Okay. Kirklees Libraries has this in every single library, I think. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but this is the Bible. This tells you about every kind of writing, non-fiction, fiction, every competition. It's a list of all the publishing houses. It's a list of all the agents, the festivals, anything to do with writing books. This is probably one of the best investments that you can make, and they update it every year. So again, it's even got all the contact phone numbers. It's got great articles written by authors experienced in all of those genres. I was there's even one by J.K. Rowling this year, but it's really good, and you spend forever reading this and using a highlighting pen if you're serious about getting your writing out there. Okay. Again, local writers groups. One of the best things I ever did was, and I think I probably wouldn't have written fiction perhaps ever if I hadn't joined a local writing group. So Holmfirth Writers Group I've mentioned, there's Huddersfield Authors Circle if you're in the Kirklees areas, there's Batley Poets. I haven't mentioned poetry yet, but there's an awful lot you can do with poetry in terms of blending fiction and non-fiction. We should get some poets along to give us some comments on that and how they've blended it into become faction. You can contact Kirklees Libraries if you want a list of the writers groups. Kirklees Author Forum, which represents authors in the area, again, that's on Facebook. You can find that, join along and get some support that way. But last but not least is you need to get along to a library or order and use the click and collect service. Look at Libby, look at Overdrive, because everything that I've been talking about now is available to you free. If you don't want to buy anything for anybody ever, if you haven't got the money, all you need to do is get your library card, get online and start looking at some of the writing books that are available via Libby and via Overdrive, and by going into the library now that we're opening up a bit more. So that's that. Thank you very much. Those are my final, I suppose, tips. So we'll talk at the end, if it's okay with Nicola, about the events that are coming up, those during the next few weeks. But before we do that, I'm going to run through my absolute favourite books, which I read every single one of these and had no idea that it was a work of fiction or a non-fiction novel, whatever you want to call it. I think this is perhaps one of my all-time favourites, I have to say. You can see how dog-eared it is. This is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. And I took this to Africa with me and I read it there. And I had no idea what it was about, other than it was about a family of missionaries coming over from the USA to bring Jesus to everybody in Africa, as many families did. And it was just wonderful because it taught me about the history of the Congo. And as I'm reading it, of course, I was completely ignorant. I wasn't living in the Congo, and I knew nothing about the Congo for whatever reason. I am an ignorant person, but I learned so much about history and the history of Central Africa from this book. And she tells a cracking story. She's such a good author. If you like Margaret Atwood, for example, you will love Barbara Kingsolver. And then, of course, every time she brought a book out, I had to read it. And this again, see, I even buy them in hard books when they're gorgeous. This is The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, and this is about the artist Frida, which I didn't realise until I was about a chapter in. I forgot I was reading a work of fiction. It's probably the best way to read, actually. And then it ends up with, I don't want to spoil it for you, but Trotsky makes an appearance. So it's got everything in there, and it's all based on historical research and fact, and she just does it so cleverly and so beautifully. So next, we've got something completely different. A product of Blue Moose Authors, way based in Yorkshire, who produce some of the most fantastic indie published books in the UK. This is Stop, Don't Read This by Leonora Rusmova. Some of you might even remember this case that happened. The teacher in question, the author, was sacked from a job by basically getting a group of lads who weren't doing well at school really interested in English. And she did this by writing a story for them. They dared her basically to write stories starring them. So this is the story of what happened to her as a teacher and the way she was treated and how the kids all stood up for her, and then the actual story that she wrote for them. So it weaves the fact with the fiction that she produces. I've never read anything quite like this, and it's a real revelation to see what happened to her just because she was so passionate about teaching English to kids. And heads up for Blue Moose, because they published this book in support of what she'd done, and it's just such a great book, the way she's weaved it all together. Next one, you might be familiar with this, Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. Again, this book is based on the mystery behind this painting of who was this girl. So if you like history, if you like the history of art, then do read this, because again, she's wonderful at producing this kind of work. Next one, again, I'm getting a bit Blue Moose mad here, but Blue Moose published this first. It's the Gallows Pole by Benjamin Myers, and it's set in Halifax, the true story based on historical research of the coiners, who basically nearly crashed the entire English economy by printing their own money. Fascinating story, really good, totally up my street, this one. And we have here something completely different again. This is Becoming Unbecoming. Now this, you might call it a graphic novel or a work of art. Absolutely stunning illustration. This is the true story of Jack the Ripper, which makes for extremely compelling reading, I have to say. But it's also her story growing up as a girl, a young woman, during the time of the Ripper in West Yorkshire. So she puts all her own experiences with the actual what was happening almost week by week with the Ripper over the years. And again, this is one that I'll keep forever, because she's just a fantastic storyteller. And if you like graphic novels and if you like art, this is one of the best things that you can read. And finally, I think we've got Peaky Blinders. Those of you that have seen the TV series will be well aware of the fact that the Peaky Blinders were based on a real gang in Birmingham. Now, as a historian, it made me tear my hair out, because I kept wanting to shout, but it was the 1890s, it wasn't the 1920s. And this is the book, The Real Peaky Blinders. So this is a non-fiction by Professor Carl Chin, who's a bit of an expert on all things gangs in Birmingham. And this is my daughter's. I'm sorry, I'll drop her in it now. It's not mine. I would never look at these kind of books. Of course I would. This is basically the story of filming Peaky Blinders and why the story developed in the way that it did. So together, I would say these are a blend of fiction and non-fiction and fiction. And here we have as well, some of you who are into the Brontes might have read Ill Will by Michael Stewart. Michael Stewart, again, based in Huddersfield at Huddersfield University, heads up the creative writing department, and he wanted to know what happened to Heathcliff in those missing years. I must admit, I'd always wondered as well, but there you go. That's Michael's story, Ill Will, and this is a terrific read. It's wow, it's quite grim in parts, but it is really good, and I think he's captured that bit of almost the fiction of Emily Bronte, but with what could have actually have happened. So it's very clever. Again, so those are my favourites, and I've got so many more. I would spend all day talking about my favourite books and blending different genres, fiction, non-fiction. But I think we're going to go over to either Kirsty now or to Jazz.
Yes,
I'm going to try and give you some even more fun reads.
Yeah, there's just one question that's come up now. So if you could tell your younger writing self about anything, what would it be?
Don't panic. I think there's this thing that when anything in life, when you suddenly realise, well, that's me. I'm finally giving time and attention to something I've always wanted to do, and I've overcome my fear. Okay, mine might not be going out when I'm a writer and wearing a t-shirt, but it's almost like when you realise what your ambition is, you want to rush it and you want to see results really fast. And the one thing that thankfully I did listen to other people was just to calm that bit down and to say, look, the great thing about books is they don't have a shelf life. And and this is a difference again, between fiction and non-fiction. For example, non-fiction at some point would need updating, a work of fiction isn't going to go anywhere. So there's no worrying that I've missed the boat. That's what I'd say. It's all about almost indulging yourself with the creative process that you might have neglected for a long time, and don't send a piece of your writing out without having sat in it for a while, without having gotten somebody else to read it, without editing it to death, because you will regret it. I mean, there's nothing that you can't ever have another shot at, but it's patience. If you're not a patient person, this is the time to learn it. That's a good question.
Lovely. Thanks, Chris. That's brilliant. So I think Jazz is going to come on next. So, right, let's have a look. There we go. Jazz. Hello. Right. Jazz, have you muted yourself? We can't hear you, Jazz. Have you got an unmute?
No, it should
oh, that's it. That's it. We can hear you now. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. So I think Jazz is going to talk about some of the non-fiction that you like reading and things that you used to read as a child as well.
When I was, it's weird. When I was much younger, my mum said I wasn't really a natural reader at all. And she does it all on getting me to read anything. And I think that was one of the reasons why she started, when she went to the library with me, to get pointing me towards the non-fiction books. And I ended up with a lot of natural history stuff. I can remember being very interested in owls long before Harry Potter, obviously. I've got in ahead of that trend. And but I think maybe the non-fiction books were in the sense that, you'd have to read a story from start to finish, and maybe I didn't have the patience. I don't know. But with a non-fiction book, you can pick that up, have a look at something, and put it down again, and then refer to it again. And you're not reading it in that sort of linear way, but you are reading something.
Yeah.
And it left me with a lifelong interest. We still sort of, partner and I are big sort of bird watchers now, and it has obviously had a profound effect. Which is possibly why a few years ago, if you remember, when we had an exercise where every member of staff in the libraries had to pick a book to buy that they would recommend to somebody. And I chose the Haynes Manual for the International Space Station, being, pathetic space nerd, obviously. But the book is brilliant in that what's not to like, what's not fascinating about space exploration and space travel. But apart from that, it's a book that you can pick up, and if maybe you haven't got the sort of the patience or whatever, or the language at that point to read a story from start to finish, you can pick that up and you can read one bit of it about the accommodation quarters or whatever, about how it was built, and then put it down, read, come back to it again, and there's almost like less pressure, I think. And I never actually moved towards fiction at all. I'm looking at, I've got my Goodreads page open here, and I'm just looking now. Some of them I'm probably not going to share with you. But yeah, there was one I've read very recently, which is great, which is Detroit 67, the year that changed soul, Stuart Cosgrove. I don't think he won a couple of awards. And he maps the sort of the rise of the Motown label against the sort of decline of Detroit itself as a city, and looks at the civil rights movement. And it's a fascinating read. Really enjoyed that. There are any number of books about space exploration and the individuals who undertook it, predictably. But there are some, again, that fall into the category of, that I've always said, truth is often stranger than fiction. And some of the, when you read around the subject as well, and you read about the characters. One book that I read recently is Wally Funk's Race for Space. And she's one of the astronaut candidates, the women astronaut candidates, who were told that they were trained at the same time as the Mercury candidates, the men. And they were told bluntly that their trading would come to an end, they would not go into space. So they went back to their day jobs, whatever they did. But one woman, Wally, continued to try and get into space. She's a pilot, and she'll be 91 now, and she's got a ticket for the first Richard Branson flight into space, whenever that is. But to read the book, you know, this woman is the most determined woman in the world. She's lived several lifetimes in her one, and you know, again, sometimes you think, you know, you genuinely couldn't make this stuff up. I'm sitting in the office at Home Firth Library, so it's probably a good time to mention the Home Firth Tiger, Fenella, and the book that was written about her. If you think about them, people living in the modern era, and the idea of people raising a Sumatran tiger in a terraced house in Home Firth, again, it just beggars belief, really. It just seems so far beyond the bounds of reality that you literally couldn't make it up. But you know, it did happen. But there's all sorts of things here. Music biographies. Inevitably, if I get interested in reading, listening to somebody, I more or less always try and find books about them. I do get a bit obsessive about subjects. If I find something interesting, then I'll go away and find as many books as I can about it. I think there's about 4 or 5 books about women's football that I'd read over the last couple of years, which is, again, a fascinating and pretty sad story, really, when you consider that women's football was officially banned until 1971, which isn't that long ago, really. So the idea that it was illegal to play women's football at an association football ground. But there you have it. One of the best books I would recommend to everybody, even if you're a fan of football, women's or otherwise or not, is In a League of Their Own, which is about one of the pioneering teams, the Dick Kerr ladies, the munitionettes. They worked in munitions factories in the First World War, and they took up football as a pastime. And before long, they were playing games in front of crowds as big as men's teams. And without ruining the story for everybody, they go on tour to America, where they're told that that women's football is established there, and there'll be women's teams for them to play, and they weren't. They played men's teams, and they beat several of them. At one of the games, they were challenged to a race by the American 4x100 relay team, and they beat them as well. And the book carries on like that. You literally, you know, again, it really is something that you couldn't make up. And that's really that's part of the attraction for me. I find it interesting as well that if you think of it as a genre, we define it by what it isn't. We call it non-fiction. So it's not got fiction in it. It's just literally everything else. And, you know, then that's a nice thing. You know, all forms of life are represented here.
Yeah. Lovely. That's brilliant. Thanks, Jazz. That was fascinating. Really good. All right. Okay. So I think we've got Kirsty up next as well. Here we go. Okay.
Right.
You okay,
Hi, guys.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I was. I've done a list. You ask a librarian about books that they recommend or books that they love, and I've got a list because there's too many. But I was thinking about this because this is the session with our writer in residence, lovely Chris, and I see that we've got similar books that we picked out actually. But I was thinking this from kind of a writing perspective that for me as a reader, I do read some non-fiction, but the majority of books I read are fiction. But when I read non-fiction, I don't often pick books that on a topic that I'm interested in, unlike Jazz, who's football and his space interests. And I had to buy the books that he was talking about, the space aid, the Haynes Manual one. I remember buying that one. But I don't often go that way, and I go because I like how it's written. I like non-fiction that has a strong narrative that reads like fiction like that. So anything by Claire Tomlin, it could be a fiction novel, the way that she writes, the one that she wrote about Dickens and Jane Austen, absolutely brilliant, that they read like novels. And I think that's something from a writing perspective, if you choose to think about writing non-fiction, is that you're not limiting your audiences. But if you write with the same engagement that fiction writers write, then you will bring in a whole new audience as well and bring them along with you. Back onto football, but Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch, oh my goodness me, absolutely brilliant book. I love his fiction as well, but Fever Pitch is an absolutely brilliant example of non-fiction that's written with that kind of same strong narrative, kind of a character-led things that you'd expect to find in a novel as well. So I would absolutely recommend thinking around those ways. George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier and Down Out in Paris and London, absolutely blew my mind as a teenager when I wrote those, because I was a big fiction reader again, but they read like a fiction novel in that kind of way that it drove you on to find out more. So that's what I was thinking, not that you're limiting your audience, never think like that about your writing, but that you're just, if you write with that same passion that your people write about fiction, then you're just opening up whole new audiences to your writing. So yes, so I've got a little screen so I can hide myself. So I'm going to bring it up. Oh, we're going to do that one first. Okay, so these are just some of the books that I picked out. I'm not going to go through them all in detail because far too long, and this was hard work to narrow it down onto 2 little slides. Oh, I feel like I've left some real loved ones behind. So this is just a mixture, and again, I wouldn't pick these books, even though they're dealing with topics or real life situations based on the situation. I read because I love the way the writer writes. So, and a lot of these you'll know, I used to run reading groups, and I used to find that faction was a great way to engage with reading groups, because if you get a fiction book in a reading group sometimes and you'll go, oh yeah, I like that, and then that's the conversation quite over. But if it's something that's based in fact and based in real life, or based but being twisted, like Chris was talking about Peaky Blinders, that's where really great conversations happen, when people get kind of angsty or kind of really passionate about, well, they've changed this one tiny bit, and it's great. It's great topics for conversations in reading groups as well. So yeah, if you're writing and you're setting out on a journey and you're wanting to bring people on, think about reading groups and how they work as an organism and a kind of a meeting ground. Think about them and how you write for them to have those conversations, because that's where big book sales can happen if you write one that book groups like reading. Anyway, so The Reader by Bernhard Schlink is a fantastic book. It's like I say, I'm not going to go into great detail because spoiler alert, but it's about the Holocaust and about life in Germany after the Holocaust, and it's a thriller, and it's been made into a film, as a lot of these have, and it's a really good read. It kind of made you think more about what it's like to be living in a country where your history, which is very relevant for now, your history it's not that far off, and it's so awful. It's a great book, really worth reading. Orange is Not the Only Fruit, the wonderful Jeanette Winterson. That's just a phenomenal book about growing up and discovering your sexuality in a religious household, and the kind of the friction that created. Brilliant one, based on autobiography. Quite a lot of these are based on autobiography, the ones that I particularly enjoyed. If you've not come across The Bone Sparrow by Zaina Frelon, I apologise if I say names wrong, I'm not very good. This is, I think, destined to be a modern classic. It's a children's book. Quite a lot of mine are children's books as well, about a child who's born in a refugee camp. And the suffering of innocence in refugee situations. Really, really good read. If you're a teacher looking for a book for a class, brilliant read. Boy's Own Story by Edmund White, again, another autobiography about someone that dealt with their sexuality growing up. Brilliant read again. Sorry, I'm just going to say brilliant read. That's not very helpful, is it? But yeah, I don't give too much away. But my memory of books is usually about the feeling that left with me rather than the great detail that I remember about how they were written. I included Wolf Hall, which just blew my mind again when I read that one. And I spelt Mantell wrong. Excellent. You can spot that for me, people. Yeah, I've missed out the T. Excellent. You can have that one on me. So it's Hilary Mantel. If you've not read they're big reads, but it's a fantastic series written by someone with a great grasp of historic detail. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII. It just gives you a wonderful insight into what it potentially could have been like during the period. Overheard in a Tower Block is by I'm going to say fantastic again, the wonderful, we'll go with wonderful, Joseph Coelho. Big favourite in Kirklees Libraries. He's been part of our Library Adventures live programme. But this is a book of poems, a kind of narrative poem book, which deals with a child growing up living in a big inner city tower block. It's not one for younger children, one for teens perhaps, but it's, to be honest, anyone could read it. And he's a wonderful poet, and well worth everyone's attention. But again, based on a reality of how someone grew up, and then using that experience to create poetry that's engaging for young people as well as for adults. Great talent. Now the last two, this was my last slide, we put them in the wrong order. The last two are sneaky ones. These aren't based in on real things. These are based on other books that have existed. So like Ill Will, that Chris was going to, I was torn with putting Why Sargasso Sea in or Ill Will. I went with Why Sargasso Sea, but it's about this kind of imaginative exercise where you recreate more for characters that are in other books. So Why Sargasso Sea is a very early and a great example of that. But another one that I absolutely adore is the Thursday Next series by Jasper Fforde, which does exactly the same thing, but his characters nip in and out of all sorts of books. Jane Eyre, I mean, it goes into nursery rhymes. He creates this wonderful world that I want to live in, where you've got someone who's a private eye, or it's not private eye, but she works for I'm not going to give anything away, but it's kind of a thriller, but based in all these different books, these different characters, and what's Heathcliff really like? Is he a bit sulky? Is he a bit petulant? Oh, it's wonderful. It's just a wonderful imaginative exercise, and I think a great way to, if you're really stuck for an idea for getting your writing kind of started, or you've hit a block, just think about a book that you love. It could be a nursery rhyme, it could be a children's book, it could be the Gruffalo. What happened to that mouse? What happened to the snake in the Gruffalo? What happens next to those characters? As an exercise, I think it's a brilliant thing to do, and just to get that kind of idea to spark you off. And then you can do these wonderful series like Thursday Next, which I adore. We've got another one. I'll go through quickly. I have got another little overlay. There we go. So I realized when I had to knock these down a little bit, that I had a lot that dealt with war. And whilst I did study history, it's not something that I go and read non-fiction books about the time or the period. But you have a great author who has a topic that expands everyone's kind of thinking, the philosophy, the religion, all these kind of things, and you have this wonderful experience as a reader. And sometimes it doesn't actually matter that you're interested in this subject or not. So Regeneration by Pat Barker is a great example of that. Another great reading group book. So much where she's brought in the experience not only of the First World War and the trauma for soldiers during this First World War, but she also kind of reimagines the life of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen as well, two First World War poets. So she brings two things together in a series that's hard to put down but hard to read. Very, very good. English Passengers. I put this one on and I thought, oh, Kirsty, is it actually based on lots of detail? But it's very reminiscent and it's very detailed of the time, but maybe the experience of the people on the boat isn't actually one that happened. But Matthew Neal's English Passengers is based in the mid-19th century and incorporates characters that you might recognize that we kind of have described to us from that period, but also includes details of Aboriginal struggle when people arrived on big boats on their shores and tried to convert them or tried to take over their land. It's a really good read. It's a great reading group book, that one. Again, you could have an interest in a very small period of history, but make it into just a massive exploration of life and everything. How am I doing for time, Nick? You know I'll go on for ages talking about books. Am I okay? I've also included Beloved by Toni Morrison, a very important book that I think we all should read. There's a few on here that I think we should be encouraging young people to read as well. This one deals with the legacy of slavery, as well as incorporating like a ghost story into it as well. Just made a huge impression on me when I read that as a teen. Daughter of Time is, again, it's a different kind of twist on faction. This is by Josephine Tay, wonderful Josephine Tay, where the story this time is about a police inspector, Alan Grant, who's in hospital and is bored. And as a way of engaging himself in the time, he tries to solve the enigma of the princes in the tower and Richard III. Did Richard III have the princes killed? And it's done as a kind of it's a fantastic book. I reread it, and it's one that I recommend from teenage years onwards. I love that book. It's an interesting way of again incorporating a kind of a police kind of crime story into the past as well. Brilliant. Girl with a Pearl Earring, Chris already mentioned. Coram Boy by Jamila Gavin. Again, another really, I think, strong teenage book. This one, maybe even just teenagers. This one. It's about the Coram man who took babies from desperate mothers, and he was promising to take them to the foundling hospital, but instead was murdering them. It's a bleak period of British history, but told in a really engaging is the wrong word, but in a book that you wanted to finish. Really, really good book by Jamila Gavin. I could have picked lots of Beryl Bainbridge, but I went with The Birthday Boys, which is the story of Captain Scott and the doomed South Pole mission, and she's wonderful with voices, Beryl Bainbridge. If not read any of hers, she creates the voices of the individual members of the team on the expedition. And the last page, oh dearie me, oh that's a good book. Don't read it on the bus, people. There's a lot of these books I would say don't read in the bus unless you've got good control of your emotions when you're in public. Me, not so good, not so good. And then the last one I've got on there is again another war one, which is All Quiet on the Western Front by E.M. Remarque, another classic of the time, which was written at the end of the First World War and is based on the author's experiences, but from the German perspective, which we sometimes get, when there's so many books published in our country, that it's good to take that time to take and look at books written by another perspective from someone living elsewhere. So that one kind of blew my mind at the time, and again as a teenager, which is why I still remember it. A lot of mind blowing going on with books, I know, but I do love to read. That's my list. Thank you, Nicola.
Oh, thanks, Kirsty. That's a brilliant list. I'll have a look at those books. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'll just get Chris back on again. Hello, Chris.
Hiya.
Another question. Where are we? Okay, there we go. Have you read anything that made you think differently about fiction?
Yeah, books how to write fiction always make me think differently. I wish I'd never read them. No, that's been the one thing I think that's challenged the fiction that I choose to read, and I guess how I assess whether it's a good read or not is the experts who've written all these books on how to write fiction. And I won't tell you which books to read, but it's all about storytelling. It's all about how you construct it. And it's one of those things that I would just say, just get out there and do your writing to begin with, and then start perhaps educating yourself a little bit more on what is constituting storytelling, what elements are in it. Because I think you can kind of stop yourself from moving forward and building your courage up if you start reading, oh my God, I'm not doing it right. It says I have to do it this way. Just write and then read about what other people say about writing fiction.
Lovely. Chris. Right. Did you want me to share the screen with what's coming in the next Writer in Residence session?
I'll quickly run you through it. I'm sure you are all capable of reading it, but yeah, these are just what we've got up and coming. Dates already booked in. The Reluctant Readers session that we did was just phenomenally just so successful. We really enjoyed it. We had so many people viewing it on the day afterwards. So we've obviously a bit inundated with demand to do another session where we're going to be looking in particular at the experiences of somebody who had dyslexia, for example, growing up and wasn't diagnosed until later life. And yeah, schools, dealing with schools and reluctant readers. If you have a reluctant reader in your household, how you might liaise with schools better, try and understand what pressures schools have on them as well, and really lots and lots and lots of top tips for getting your kids reading if it's like pulling teeth with them. So that's Thursday the 5th of November, 11 a.m. It'll be on Watch again, and you can watch the first one already, which is on YouTube if you've not seen that one yet. Then we've got, after that, a session I'm going to be doing, chatting a little bit about the Hidden Victorian Muslim, which is my research, I guess, into what I was talking about before, trying to delve into the past when it's not easily obtainable, and producing a book out of it and a story that's just kind of my experience, and perhaps encouraging other people who are really interested in family history and hidden histories and secret histories. So that's Thursday the 12th of November. And after that, we've got a Christmas one coming up. I can't read what date that is. I think you'll have to tell me. No, it's early on in December. So we're going to be doing something a little bit lighthearted and perhaps a bit humorous, and filling us all with the festive cheer that we really deserve this year. So they're all on Kirklees Libraries Writing Residence page on the main website. And as we get more and more subjects coming up, we'll be bunging them up there. Thank you.
Okay. It's on Thursday the 3rd of December is our Christmas.
I'll be there.
Okay. Right. I'll just add everybody to the stream. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's it for today's session. I really hope you've all enjoyed it, and thank you to our panel of guests for today for a lovely session. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Ta-ra. See you.
Mhm.